I'll tell you what kind of man I was at 26, so you understand what I rode back to fix. I was the kind who could look a good woman in the eye on a Monday and be gone by Thursday, saddlebags packed before she woke, a note on the kitchen table that said more about my cowardice than a dozen arguments could. Marin Halstead had done nothing wrong. She was a week from becoming my wife. I rode away because the trail was easier than the staying, and I told myself it was freedom or youth or some restlessness in my blood I couldn't name. 7 years on, I knew what it actually was. Fear. Plain and unforgivable. I broke her heart, and I knew it even then, and I rode away anyway. I came back in late October of 1883, when the cottonwoods along Redstone Creek had gone the color of old bone, and the sky hung low and gray over the flats. I had no right to come back. No speech prepared, no justification that would hold water. All I had was the knowledge that I'd spent 7 years proving to myself that none of the other roads led anywhere worth being, and the one thing I'd left behind was the only thing I'd ever truly wanted. Word had reached me, through a cousin of a cousin, the way news moves on the frontier, that Marin had married a man named Cole, a decent man, a dry goods merchant out of Harker Junction, and that Cole had died of a fever 2 winters back, leaving her 160 acres of hardpan, a lean-roofed barn, and a daughter not yet old enough for school. I sat on my horse at the edge of her property for a long time before I rode in. The place was tired. The porch rail sagged on the left side. The barn door hung off its upper hinge and had been propped with a fence post to keep it from dragging. The kitchen garden had been put to bed for winter, but the fence around it was half down, and I could see where something deer, most likely, had been at what remained of the potato mounds. A line of wash hung stiff in the cold air. A small pair of boots sat upside down on the porch rail to drain. She came out the front door before I'd made it halfway up the path. She hadn't changed the way I'd half hoped she would, some small cruelty I'd nursed, that the years would have dimmed her somehow and made this easier. She was 31, same as me, and she looked it the way a good frontier woman looks it, strong, careful, nothing soft-wasted on regret. Her eyes found mine and stayed there, and they weren't angry. They were still. "Jubal Crane," she said, not a question, not a welcome. "Marin," I took my hat off. "I know I've got no claim on a welcome here." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at my horse, at the tools rolled in canvas behind the saddle, a draw knife, a hand auger, a set of chisels I'd been carrying for 2 years without knowing why. "The barn door needs rehanging," she said finally, "and the south fence is down in 3 places. I've been meaning to get to it before the ground freezes hard." "I'll get to it. I'm not offering you anything beyond the work." "I know that." She held my gaze one moment longer, then went back inside. I slept in the barn. I didn't ask for better. The first week I kept to the outside work and said little. I rehung the barn door on new hardware from my saddlebag. I walked the south fence and reset the posts that had heaved and tamped gravel around their bases before the frost could bite deeper. I split wood more than she'd asked for, a full winter's worth, and stacked it against the north wall of the house where it would stay dry. I didn't go inside except when invited to supper, and on those evenings I ate quietly and thanked her and went back out. Her daughter's name was Ivy. She was 4 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and a habit of watching strangers from around door frames before she decided what to make of them. By the 3rd day she decided what to make of me, which was that I was an acceptable source of interesting things. She found me behind the barn repairing a broken hay rake and stood at a careful distance, studying the work with the focused attention of someone who expects to be tested on it later. "That piece goes the other way," she said. I turned the bracket over. She was right. "Much obliged," I said. That was the beginning of it with Ivy. By the end of the 2nd week, she was following me on the afternoon rounds, nomming the chickens for me. They all had names, long names assigned with total conviction, and explaining which ones were reliable layers and which ones were, in her considered opinion, simply ornamental. Marin watched all of this from the kitchen window. I knew she was watching. I didn't perform for her. I just did the work, was honest with the child, and let whatever was going to happen unfold at its own pace. By the third week, she started talking to me at supper. Small things at first. Whether the ground was too frozen yet for the last of the fence work. Whether the loft would hold the hay she was expecting from the Miller brothers down the creek. Whether I thought the old ewe in the back pen was going to make it through winter. I answered straight. I didn't try to make myself charming or useful beyond what she asked. I'd spent 7 years being charming on the trail, talking my way into warmth and out of trouble, and I was done with it. I wanted her to see what was actually there. One evening, after Ivy had gone to bed, Marin sat down across from me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and said, without looking up from hers, "Why did you come back?" Not a question, the way she said it. A door left open an inch to see if I'd push through it wrong. "Because I was a coward when I was 26, I said. "And I've been paying for it since, and so have you, and that's not right. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know I know what I did." She was quiet for a moment. Knowing doesn't undo it. "No," I said, "it doesn't." She drank her coffee. I drank mine. The fire worked in the stove. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the edge of something colder than October usually delivered on the Redstone Flats. "Thomas was a good man," she said then. "Cole. He was steady and kind, and he loved Ivy from the first day." She looked up at me. "I want you to know that. I'm not sitting here in ruins. I built something real after you left." "I know you did," I said. "I always knew you would. That was never the question." She studied me for a moment. Then she picked up her cup and went to bed, and I went out to the barn, and the wind came in hard that night from the northwest with the smell of early snow behind it. The freeze came 3 days later. It came fast, the way the worst ones do on the high flats, temperature dropping 40 degrees between sundown and midnight. And I woke in the barn to the sound of the old ewe in the back pen, making the kind of noise that meant trouble. I was out of my bedroll and across the yard before I'd fully come awake, and I found her down, the pen half flooded from a cracked water trough that had burst in the cold, ice forming at the edges already, the other 2 ewes crowded against the far rail and blowing hard. I got the downed ewe onto dry ground and packed straw around her. Then I went to work on the trough, not to fix it, there wasn't time, but to redirect the flow away from the pen and keep the ice from spreading. I was on my knees in 6 inches of freezing water in the dark when I heard Marin come out of the house with a lantern. She didn't say anything. She set the lantern on the post and started moving the other animals to the far stall where there was dry bedding. She knew her land. We worked around each other in the dark and cold the way people work together when they don't need to explain themselves, each doing the next right thing, trusting the other to do the same. We saved all 3 ewes. The old one was in rough shape by morning, but she was standing and eating by afternoon, and I took that as a good sign. Afterward, we sat on the porch steps in the thin early light, both of us wet to the knee and too cold to go in just yet. Ivy came to the door in her nightgown, took stock of the situation with 4-year-old practicality, and went back inside. A minute later, she reappeared with a blanket and dropped it over both our shoulders at once and went back in without a word. Marin looked at the door, then at her hands. Then she made a sound that started as something else and came out as a small, exhausted laugh. I didn't say anything. "She's never done that before," Marin said. "She's a good judge of things," I said. Marin was quiet again. The sun was coming up over the east ridge, painting the frost on the grass a pale gold. A crow called once from the cottonwoods and went silent. "You left because you were afraid," she said at last. It wasn't a question this time either. It was a thing she'd worked out for herself long before I said it. "Yes." "Of what?" I thought about it. I'd thought about it for 7 years, and I still had to think before I could say it right. Of being the thing that mattered most to somebody, I said, of having something I could lose. She turned and looked at me for a long moment. The blanket Ivy had put over us was still across both our shoulders. "That's a terrible reason," she said. "Yes, but it's an honest one." She looked back at the sunrise. "I knew it wasn't anything I'd done wrong. I figured that out by the second year, knowing it didn't make it hurt less." "No," I said, "I don't imagine it did." The silence that followed was a different kind. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had finally said the real thing and were letting it settle. "I'm not the same woman," she said after a while. "Thomas changed me. Losing him changed me. Ivy changed me. I'm not the girl you left." "I know that. I need you to know that I'm not forgiving you because of anything you've done these past weeks. The fence and the wood and the barn door, that's work, and I'm grateful for it, but it doesn't balance the ledger." "I know that too," I said. "I'm forgiving you because I've been carrying it for 7 years and I'm tired." She said it plainly, the way she said most true things. "Because it's mine to put down if I want to, and I want to. That doesn't mean I trust you. That doesn't mean anything changes tomorrow." "I understand." She stood up, folded her end of the blanket over my shoulder, and started for the door. Then she stopped with her hand on the frame. "There's a section of the east fence that's going to need replacing before spring," she said. "Not patched, replaced. New posts, new wire the whole quarter-mile." "I'll get the posts cut before the ground freezes solid," I said. She went inside. I stayed on the porch steps a while longer, watching the frost melt off the grass in the growing sunlight, listening to Ivy's voice start up inside the kitchen, high and cheerful, telling her mother something important about one of the chickens. I want to tell you I knew right then that everything was going to be all right, but that would be a cleaner story than the one that actually happened. What I knew was smaller and truer. She had set something down. I was going to stay. The east fence needed a quarter-mile of new posts, and that work would take me well into spring. And by spring there would be more after that, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the first real thing I'd had in 7 years. That winter I learned what it was to matter to somebody and not run from it. Ivy taught me the names of all the chickens twice, because I kept forgetting, and Marin taught me, without meaning to, what it looked like when a woman decided to trust something slowly, the way you'd trust new ice, testing each step before putting her weight on it. I tried to be worth the testing. By the time the east fence was done, and the ground had softened, and the first green was showing along Redstone Creek, she let me sit beside her at the church service in Harker Junction. And when old Mrs. Pruitt gave us a look that said she had opinions about the arrangement, Marin looked right back at her with those still, clear eyes and didn't offer a word of explanation. I thought I might love her more in that moment than I ever had. We were married in June in the yard, with the cottonwoods leafed out green and Ivy in a white dress she had opinions about, and the Miller brothers and the preacher from Harker Junction, and a table of food the neighboring women had brought, and Marin held my hand through the whole of it like she'd decided something and was done deciding. I don't have a word for what I felt standing there. There was the yard and the cottonwoods and the sound of Ivy laughing behind us, and Marin's hand in mine, and the long reckoning of what it had cost to get there. The years wasted, the road that led nowhere, the morning on the porch steps in the frost when she'd put down a 7-year weight and told me plain it was hers to lay down and she was laying it down. She'd forgiven me, not because I'd earned it, because she chose to. I spent the rest of my life trying to be worth that choice.